What's the worst thing that happened when you defied your family's conditioning? My dad enforced total silence in our house after 7 p.m. He bought a decibel meter to keep in the house and would crash out if it registered anything above 30 decibels, which is basically a whisper. He forced us to wear special soundproof slippers and made us go outside if we had to cough or sneeze, even during rain or now. My brother once got grounded for 2 weeks because he accidentally let his stomach growl during quiet hours. Dad's justification for this was that noise was destroying society and silence would reset our brains. But really, he just wanted to forget he had a family. Mom left after 6 months, saying she'd rather be homeless than live in a tomb where she couldn't laugh at her own TV shows. She fought Dad for custody, but he had all the money and lawyers and convinced a judge that the silence was character building. Dad used her leaving and his custody victory as proof that noise corrupted people's judgment and made the rules even stricter, installing soundproof padding on every door and banning anything that could possibly make sound, including keyboards, hair dryers, even electric toothbrushes. He made us eat dinner at 6:45 and brush our teeth by 6:55 so we could be in our rooms by 7 for what he called our nightly meditation. My older brother Miles saved my sanity when he found an abandoned TV at a garage sale and secretly set it up in the basement storage room that Dad never checked because it was full of Mom's old things. He ran an extension cord from the water heater and created this tiny sanctuary where we could whisper and watch shows with the volume barely audible. We dragged down pillows to sit on and hung blankets over the door to muffle any sound that might escape, and for 2 years that cramped room was the only place we felt human after 7. The TV was ancient with a cracked screen and a power cord held together with electrical tape that always smelled like burning plastic. Miles kept saying we should get rid of it before Dad found it, but it was our only connection to normal life, so we kept using it despite the sparks it made when you turned it on. We couldn't buy a better one because Dad monitored our bank accounts for what he called frivolous purchases. One night we were watching a show with the volume so low we could barely hear it when smoke started pouring from the back of the TV. The electrical tape had melted through, and flames were climbing up the wall, spreading to Mom's old clothes in the boxes Dad had packed away. The storage room filled with toxic black smoke that made our eyes stream and lungs burn as we tried to smother the fire with blankets that caught fire too. Miles dragged me out of the room as flames spread into the ceiling beams, and we realized we had to wake Dad even though it meant revealing everything. Dad slept with noise-canceling headphones to ensure perfect silence, so Miles had to pound on his door screaming about the fire while I ran through the house opening windows to clear the smoke billowing up from the basement. When Dad finally opened his door, his face went from confused to furious as he processed the noise we were making at 11:30 at night. "There's a fire in the basement and we need to get out now," Miles shouted, grabbing Dad's arm to pull him toward the stairs where smoke was already visible. Dad jerked away and started screaming about how we'd violated his trust and destroyed the sanctity of quiet hours, even as smoke poured under his bedroom door. He actually grabbed his decibel meter to show us we'd exceeded acceptable noise levels by 300%, while flames started eating through the ceiling behind him. The smoke detector was shrieking and the fire was roaring through the walls, but Dad was more concerned about the broken rule than the fact that his house was burning down. "This is what happens when you can't follow simple instructions about maintaining silence," he said, standing there in his pajamas as the hallway filled with smoke that made us all start coughing. Miles tried to drag him toward the stairs, but Dad shoved him back, saying he needed to document our noise violation for insurance purposes, because this was clearly our fault for creating what he called a den of chaos in his house. He started taking photos of his decibel meter readings, while the ceiling began to buckle from the heat, completely oblivious to the danger because his rage about the broken silence rule had overtaken every survival instinct. "Dad, you're going to die if you don't move right now," I shouted, but he just pointed at the meter showing my voice had hit 90 decibels. The fire department sirens were getting closer, and neighbors were screaming outside, and Dad stood there breaking his own decimal meter screaming at us about how none of this would have happened if we'd just followed his simple rule about silence while his house turned into an inferno around him. The front door burst open, and the fire chief grabbed Dad by both arms, while 2 firefighters pulled Miles and me toward the stairs. Dad kept screaming about years of work being destroyed, while the chief dragged him away from his meter. The walls made loud cracking sounds from the heat as we stumbled down the stairs through thick smoke. My eyes burned, and I couldn't stop coughing as the firefighter carried me out the front door. Outside on the lawn, paramedics put oxygen masks on our faces while Dad broke free from the chief's grip. He started waving his phone at the chief, trying to show photos of the decibel readings from his meter. The chief pushed the phone away and pointed at our house where flames shot through the roof. The second-floor windows exploded from the heat, and glass rained down on the driveway. Neighbors stood in their yards with their phones out, recording Dad as he yelled about property damage we caused. The whole back of the house collapsed inward with a sound like thunder, while Dad kept arguing about broken rules. The paramedics loaded Miles and me into an ambulance while Dad got put in the back of a police car. He pressed his face against the window, still yelling about discipline and consequences we'd face. The ambulance ride took forever with the paramedic checking our oxygen levels every few minutes. At the hospital, They put us in a room and gave us breathing treatments through plastic masks. Dad showed up 20 minutes later with a police officer who looked tired of listening to him. Through the curtain, I heard Dad telling a nurse about our secret room in the basement. He called it a den of chaos and said we'd been breaking rules for years. Miles squeezed my hand when the nurse came to check on us and asked if we felt safe. She wrote something on her clipboard when we didn't answer right away. The fire investigator arrived an hour later with a notebook and lots of questions. I told him about the old TV and the electrical tape that always smelled funny. Dad interrupted from his chair to say this proved we were breaking safety rules on purpose. The investigator wrote down everything, including how Dad refused to leave during the fire. Dad demanded to know if we'd be charged with arson for having illegal electronics. The investigator just kept writing and asked more questions about the extension cord setup. 2 hours later, a woman from Child Protective Services walked into our room with a folder. She said the hospital called them about the situation and she needed to talk to us. Dad jumped up and started timing on his phone how long she talked to each of us. She took me to a different room and asked about the silence rules at home. I told her about the special slippers and having to go outside to cough. She asked what happened when we broke the rules and I explained about being grounded. When she talked to Miles, Dad paced the hallway checking his phone every 30 seconds. After she finished, she told us we'd stay somewhere else tonight while they investigated. Dad started yelling about his parental rights, but the caseworker ignored him completely. A different social worker drove us to a house across town around midnight. The foster mom opened the door wearing regular pajamas and smiled at us like we weren't strangers. She showed us to a bedroom with 2 beds and said we could talk as loud as we wanted. Miles and I stayed up past 1 in the morning just having a normal conversation. We didn't whisper once and nobody came to check the time or measure our volume. The foster mom made us hot chocolate without asking what time it was. She sat with us in the kitchen and asked if we needed anything else. The next morning, the caseworker came back and said she'd found our mom. Mom lived in an apartment 20 minutes away and was already on her way over. When Mom walked through the door, she grabbed us both and started crying hard. She kept saying she'd tried to get us back but couldn't afford lawyers to fight Dad. The caseworker had papers for emergency placement, and Mom signed them immediately without reading them. We drove to Mom's apartment in her old car that still had our drawings taped to the sun visors. Her place was tiny with just 1 bedroom and a pull-out couch in the living room. She gave us the bedroom and said she'd sleep on the couch from now on. That afternoon, Dad showed up at the CPS office with his lawyer and a huge binder. He spread out charts and graphs showing 2 years of what he called noise violations. The charts had different colors for different types of sounds we'd made after 7 p.m. He pointed at peaks on the graph where Mom's name was written in red marker. The caseworker took notes while Dad explained how our behavior got worse after Mom left. His lawyer kept nodding and adding legal terms about parental alienation and custody interference. Dad pulled out printed emails between him and Mom from before the divorce as evidence. The caseworker's face stayed blank while Dad talked for 40 minutes straight about corrupting influences. 3 days later, the fire investigator's report came through with his official findings. The fire started from the damaged TV cord and spread to boxes of Mom's old clothes. He wrote that the evacuation delay caused most of the property damage to the house. Dad called the CPS office demanding to know why we weren't being arrested for arson. The investigator had included Dad's admission about refusing to leave during the fire in his report. Back at Mom's apartment, we tried to adjust to living in such a small space. Miles and I kept whispering out of habit, even though Mom said to talk normally. She showed us the custody papers from the divorce with all Dad's lawyers' signatures. The legal bills were stapled to the back, showing amounts that made her cry again. My phone started buzzing with messages from Dad around 2 in the morning, each one angrier than the last about how we destroyed his sanctuary of silence and ruined everything he'd worked for. Mom grabbed my phone and started screenshotting every text where he called us ungrateful parasites who couldn't follow one simple rule and threatened to sue us for the full value of the house. She forwarded everything to the CPS caseworker, who replied that these messages would be added to their growing file on what she called coercive control patterns. The next morning, an insurance adjuster showed up at Mom's apartment with a clipboard full of questions about the fire after Dad filed a claim saying we intentionally burned down his house out of spite. The adjuster sat at our kitchen table taking notes while I explained about the old TV with the taped cord and how we'd been using it for 2 years, and his eyebrows kept going up when I described Dad refusing to leave during the fire. He asked Miles to draw a diagram of the basement setup and wrote down that the electrical connection wasn't up to code, and Dad should have known about fire hazards in a storage area. When I got to the school on Monday, everyone already knew about the fire because videos from the neighbors had gone viral on social media, showing Dad screaming about decibel meters while smoke poured out of the house. Kids whispered jokes about noise violations when I walked past their lockers, and someone had printed out a screenshot of Dad holding his meter while the house burned behind him. The school counselor pulled me out of second period and handed me a special pass that let me come to her office whenever I needed a quiet space to decompress. A week after the fire, Mom drove us to the CPS office for our first supervised visit with Dad, who walked in carrying his decibel meter in one hand and a notebook in the other. He set the meter on the table and announced he wanted to document that we couldn't control our volume even in professional settings. But the supervisor immediately took it away and reminded him this visit was about rebuilding relationships, not measuring sound levels. Dad spent the whole hour complaining about how loud the fluorescent lights were buzzing and kept checking his phone app that measured ambient noise. Miles started working evenings at the grocery store down the street because Dad had frozen our access to any family bank accounts and Mom was struggling to pay for food and gas. He came home after his first shift with bags under his eyes, but said stocking shelves for 8 hours was worth it to help Mom with expenses. When he handed her his first paycheck 2 weeks later, she started crying and tried to give it back, but he insisted she use it for groceries and bills. The fire investigator's final report arrived by certified mail, stating that Dad's delay in evacuating was a major factor in the property damage, and noting the house had no working smoke detectors in the basement because Dad had removed them. Dad's insurance claim got cut by more than half, and they flagged him for negligence, which meant his rates would triple if he ever got coverage again. He sent us an email with the subject line, "You cost me everything," that went on for 3 pages about how we'd destroyed hundreds of thousands in property value. CPS scheduled mandatory family therapy sessions that Dad had to attend if he wanted to keep any visitation rights, and at the first session he spent 40 minutes explaining to the therapist how noise pollution was destroying civilization. The therapist took notes without commenting, while Dad pulled up articles on his phone about the dangers of ambient sound, then scheduled individual sessions for him twice a week. Mom found a legal aid lawyer who said we had a strong case for permanent custody modification given the fire incident and Dad's documented behavior in texts and emails. Dad responded by hiring 3 lawyers from a big firm downtown who immediately filed motions challenging everything from the CPS investigation to the fire report. I started waking up at night gasping for air from nightmares where I was trapped in silent rooms filling with smoke and nobody could hear me screaming for help. The school counselor referred me to a trauma specialist who taught me breathing exercises and grounding techniques, but I still woke up most nights drenched in sweat. Mom would sit on my bed and rub my back until I could breathe normally again, never complaining about losing sleep before her early shifts. The city condemned Dad's house due to structural damage from the fire, posting a big red notice on the front door that said it was unsafe for human habitation. Dad moved into a cheap hotel near the highway, where he immediately started complaining about noise from other guests and traffic, sending us photos of his decibel meter readings at all hours showing unacceptable noise levels. The hotel manager called Mom after 2 weeks to warn us that Dad had been confronting other guests about their TV volumes and slamming on walls when people talked in the hallways. They asked him to leave after he set up recording equipment in the lobby to document what he called acoustic assault from the ice machine. 3 weeks later at the courthouse, Mom's lawyer spread printed pages across the conference table showing years of Dad's posts on noise complaint forums where he called us noise terrorists, and described punishments he wanted to try like shock collars that would activate above certain decibel levels. The lawyer had found hundreds of posts dating back 5 years where Dad detailed every sound we made and rated them on what he called his disruption scale, including recordings he'd secretly made of us breathing at night. Some posts asked other members if they knew where to buy military-grade soundproofing or how to legally enforce complete silence on minors, and one thread discussed whether removing a child's vocal cords would count as abuse if it was for their own good. The judge read through the stack of evidence with her eyebrows getting higher with each page, then ordered an immediate psychological evaluation for Dad before any custody decisions could be made. 2 months passed before our court date where Miles and I had to sit in those hard wooden chairs and tell the judge about the night of the fire, while Dad's 3 lawyers kept interrupting to ask if we'd been drinking or using drugs. I explained about the old TV with the taped cord catching fire, and Dad refusing to leave because he was documenting our noise levels, sticking to just the facts, even when the lawyers tried to make us sound like arsonists. Miles testified about Dad taking photos of his decibel meter while flames ate through the ceiling, and the judge finally asked Dad directly why he cared more about noise measurements than getting his children to safety. Dad launched into a 20-minute speech about how society was collapsing due to acoustic pollution, and we'd destroyed years of progress towards silence, completely missing the judge's point about basic parental priorities. The court-appointed psychologist's report came back 6 weeks later, stating Dad had severe anxiety disorder that manifested as obsessive need for control through enforced silence, recommending intensive therapy and only supervised visits with his children. When the psychologist read her findings in court, explaining how Dad's fixation on silence was actually a way to avoid dealing with his fear of losing control, Dad jumped up and started yelling about conspiracies between the court system and what he called the noise industrial complex. The judge granted Mom temporary full custody, with Dad allowed 2 supervised visits per month, only if he attended weekly therapy sessions, which Dad initially refused, saying the entire legal system had been corrupted by people who didn't understand the science of silence. His lawyers spent 3 days convincing him that refusing therapy meant losing all parental rights permanently, showing him case law and precedents until he finally agreed to comply just to maintain some access to us. We moved our stuff into Mom's small apartment where she'd set up bunk beds in the single bedroom. And those first weeks were weird because we kept tiptoeing around and whispering out of habit, even though she told us we could be as loud as we wanted. I dropped a plate while doing dishes and froze waiting for punishment that never came, and Mom just handed me a broom saying accidents happen, and at least now we could actually hear them happen. She bought us each a pair of headphones and said we could listen to music whenever we wanted, at whatever volume felt good, and Miles played the same song on repeat for 3 hours, just because he could. Dad's first therapy appointment turned into a disaster when he showed up with a briefcase full of academic papers about noise pollution and spent the entire hour lecturing the therapist about decibel damage to developing brains. The therapist told him they needed to focus on rebuilding relationships with his children rather than discussing societal theories. But Dad demanded a different therapist who would understand what he called the real science. Meanwhile, the insurance company launched their own investigation and discovered Dad had known about the electrical problems in the house, but refused to fix them because repair work would have been too noisy during the day. They found emails where he disconnected smoke alarms throughout the house because their occasional beeping violated his quiet hours policy, and they filed a fraud lawsuit seeking full repayment of his claim plus damages. Mom's lawyer added all this evidence to our custody case file, showing a pattern of Dad prioritizing silence over basic safety measures that any reasonable parent would take. 3 months after the fire, we had our first supervised visit at the CPS office, where Dad managed not to mention decibels or noise levels even once, though his hands shook the whole time like an addict going through withdrawal. He asked about school and actually seemed to listen when I talked about my classes, though I could see him glancing at his phone where I knew he had a decibel meter app running in his pocket. The supervisor wrote in her notes that it showed progress, though Dad spent the last 5 minutes of the visit asking if the fluorescent lights in the room were making a humming sound that only he could hear. Miles decided to put off starting college to help Mom with bills and make sure I was okay through all the custody stuff, getting a job at a warehouse loading trucks at night. Dad sent a 10-page letter about how we were destroying our futures, and Miles was throwing away his potential. But Miles just said living without fear was worth more than following Dad's life plan for us. He started researching trade schools with flexible schedules that would let him work while learning electrical or plumbing skills, saying at least he already knew what not to do with electrical tape. 6 months after the fire, the judge made the custody arrangement permanent with Mom getting full custody, and Dad limited to supervised visits as long as he continued therapy and followed behavioral agreements. Dad's lawyer argued this violated his fundamental parental rights, but the judge cited child welfare as the priority and said Dad had repeatedly shown he couldn't put our safety above his personal obsessions. Dad sat there in complete silence for once, his shoulders sagging as he realized he'd lost everything he'd tried to control, though I could see his fingers twitching like he wanted to pull out his decibel meter one last time. The counselor Mom found through her support network signed me up for a teen group that met Wednesday nights at the community center. And walking into that first meeting 3 weeks later felt like entering a room full of people who spoke the same weird language I did. There were 12 other kids sitting in metal folding chairs eating stale cookies and drinking watered-down juice, while the facilitator asked us to share what brought us there. One girl talked about her mom who made her weigh herself 3 times a day and locked the fridge between meals. A guy my age described his dad's rule about only speaking in complete sentences with proper grammar or facing hour-long lectures about linguistic decay. Another kid's parents had installed cameras in every room, including the bathroom, to monitor productivity levels. We all sat there nodding because we understood that specific kind of crazy that sounds made up to normal people but was just Tuesday in our houses. When I mentioned the decibel meter, everyone laughed, but not in a mean way. More like finally someone else gets how absurd yet terrifying these rules felt. The facilitator had us do this exercise where we listed our parents' rules on paper, then ceremonially ripped them up, which sounds dumb, but actually felt pretty good. Meanwhile, Dad had moved into a 1-bedroom apartment with soundproofing foam covering every wall like some kind of recording studio for silence. He started this blog called The Quiet Revolution, where he wrote 1,000-word posts about how the family court system discriminated against parents who valued peace and order. Mom's lawyer had to monitor it because he kept posting details about the custody case, despite court orders not to discuss it publicly. He'd write these long rants about how society was collapsing because people couldn't appreciate silence anymore, and how his children had been corrupted by what he called the noise industrial complex. Within 2 weeks, he got his first cease and desist letter for violating the gag order. He took the posts down but put them back up with names changed to Parent A and Children B and C, like that fooled anyone. The lawyer sent another warning saying the judge wouldn't be amused by these transparent workarounds. My birthday came around in early spring, and Mom asked what I wanted to do, which was such a simple question, but felt huge after years of silent birthdays where Dad would leave a card on my dresser. She ended up inviting a few kids from the school over for pizza and cake. Nothing fancy, but there was music playing from speakers and people talking at normal volume. When everyone started singing happy birthday, I actually flinched at the sound of multiple voices together. My hands started shaking and I could feel that old panic rising up my chest. Miles saw me freezing up and grabbed the stereo remote, cranking the volume until the music drowned out my anxiety. He grinned at me from across the room while Mom laughed at something someone said, and I forced myself to stay present instead of running to find somewhere quiet. The next week, Dad's therapist submitted her monthly report to the court, saying he was technically compliant with sessions, but making minimal therapeutic progress. She wrote that he spent most sessions lecturing her about studies on noise pollution and its effects on cognitive function rather than addressing his controlling behavior. He'd bring printed articles and PowerPoint presentations to therapy like he was teaching a class instead of working on himself. The therapist recommended extending supervision requirements indefinitely since he showed no recognition that his behavior had endangered his children. The judge agreed and added another 6 months before they'd even consider reviewing the arrangement again. Around that same time, the condemned house finally went on the market with a bright red "for sale" sign stuck in the dead grass out front. Dad insisted on attending every showing to explain to potential buyers that the fire damage wasn't due to negligence, but rather his children's rebellion. The real estate agent started getting complaints from buyers who said this angry man had cornered them in the burned kitchen, lecturing about proper electrical safety. After the third complaint, the agent began scheduling viewings exclusively during Dad's therapy appointments. The house sat on the market for 2 months before some developers bought it for half what Dad paid, planning to tear it down and build townhouses. Dad sent us a letter saying the sale was highway robbery, enabled by a corrupt system that punished conscientious parents. Mom got promoted to shift supervisor at her job, now that she didn't have to leave early twice a week for court hearings and lawyer meetings. Her boss said she'd been considering Mom for months, but couldn't promote someone with such an unpredictable schedule. We went to this Italian place to celebrate where the tables were crammed together and everyone talked loud enough to hear over the kitchen noise. Mom ordered wine and let Miles have a sip while I got unlimited breadsticks. At the next table, an older couple kept shooting us looks, and finally the woman leaned over to say we were being too loud for a family restaurant. Mom turned to her with the biggest smile and said they were welcome to find somewhere quieter if it bothered them that much. The woman's face went red, but she turned back to her meal while we kept talking and laughing like normal people do at restaurants. A week later, Dad sent this long, rambling letter about how he was considering joining a monastery, where the monks took vows of silence and understood the value of quiet contemplation. He wrote 5 pages about different monasteries he'd researched and their policies on visitors and communication with the outside world. Mom didn't even respond, but her lawyer filed it as evidence that Dad was more interested in escaping to silence than rebuilding relationships with his kids. We never heard anything more about the monastery plan, though Dad did start attending silent meditation retreats every other weekend. By late spring, almost 6 months after the fire, Miles and I could finally sleep most nights without waking up gasping from dreams about smoke and flames. We shared a room at Mom's apartment with 2 twin beds pushed against opposite walls and a dresser we split down the middle. Sometimes we'd stay up past midnight just talking about random stuff like school or games or whatever, still amazed we could have actual conversations after dark without whispering. Mom would knock on the wall sometimes and joke about charging us rent based on words per minute if we didn't quiet down. Dad's supervised visits started getting less frequent as he canceled for various conferences about noise pollution and urban planning. He'd send these formal emails to the supervisor about schedule conflicts with important symposiums on acoustic architecture or whatever. The supervisor noted in her reports that he'd canceled 6 of the last 10 visits, always with elaborate excuses about professional obligations. When he did show up, he'd complain the visitation room was too loud, even though we barely talked during those awkward hours. He'd sit there with his arms crossed, saying the fluorescent lights were humming and the air conditioner was rattling, and how were we supposed to have meaningful conversation with all these distractions? For English class that spring, I had to write a personal essay about a life-changing experience, and obviously I wrote about the fire. I spent 3 weeks on it, trying to explain what it felt like living in mandated silence and how the fire both destroyed our house and freed us from it. My teacher read it and asked if I wanted to submit it to this contest about overcoming adversity with a $500 prize. I told her I wasn't ready for that kind of attention, for people to read our story and judge whether our trauma was inspiring enough. She said she understood and handed it back with, "Thank you for sharing," written at the top instead of a grade. Summer came and Mom started bringing this guy around. She met at a support group for parents dealing with custody battles. His name was Steve, and he had 2 kids from his own messy divorce, and one Saturday, he suggested we all go to this arcade downtown that had just opened. The place was packed with screaming kids and beeping games and music so loud you could feel it in your chest, and I kept waiting for that old panic to hit, but instead, I just felt free. Mom and Steve watched us play skee-ball while his kids ran around trying every machine, and when someone's game made this huge victory siren go off, I actually laughed instead of freezing up. We stayed for 3 hours just making noise like normal families do, and on the drive home, Mom reached back and squeezed my shoulder when she saw me smiling. The custody review came up a year after the fire, and Dad didn't even show up to the courthouse, just sent his lawyer with a letter about scheduling conflicts with some silent meditation retreat he couldn't miss. The judge read his excuse out loud and shook her head, then made Mom's full custody permanent and removed all the supervision requirements for Dad's visits if he ever wanted them. Mom cried right there in the courtroom, and Miles had to help her walk out because her legs were shaking so bad from relief. 2 weeks later, Dad sent an email asking if Miles and I wanted to spend a weekend at his new apartment, promising no decibel meters or silence rules or any of his old restrictions. Miles and I sat at the kitchen table for 3 days straight, talking about whether we should go, weighing every possibility of what could go wrong. Mom kept saying she'd support whatever we decided, but we could see how nervous she got every time we brought it up. We finally emailed back saying we weren't ready yet. Maybe someday, but not now. And Dad replied with just, "I understand," which somehow made us feel worse than if he'd gotten angry. Mom got promoted at work, and between that and Miles picking up more shifts at the grocery store, we had enough money to move to a bigger place with actual bedrooms for everyone. The first night in my own room, I turned on music and kept raising the volume, testing each level to see when the fear would kick in, but it never did. I played songs until 2 in the morning just because I could, and nobody banged on the wall or checked decibel readings or made me go stand outside. When December came, Dad sent holiday cards with these long, handwritten notes about respecting our boundaries and hoping we'd reconnect when we felt ready. There was nothing about noise or silence or his theories about society, just regular parent stuff about missing us and being proud of how we were doing. Mom kept them in a folder in her desk drawer, saying maybe someday we'd want to read them again when we were older. 2 years passed, and Miles finally enrolled in community college while keeping his part-time job, taking night classes for automotive repair. I was finishing high school with decent enough grades considering everything we'd been through, mostly B's and C's, but passing everything. Mom framed both our report cards on the fridge, even though they weren't anything special, just happy we were moving forward and doing normal teenage stuff. The court sent over Dad's therapy reports showing he was finally taking treatment seriously after 2 years of fighting it, though his therapist noted he still struggled with control issues and accepting responsibility. She thought he might be ready for unsupervised visits within another year if he kept progressing, but reading that just made my stomach hurt because we knew we'd never be ready even if he was. Senior year, I got accepted to a state college 4 hours away, nothing fancy but far enough to feel like a real fresh start. Mom cried happy tears when the acceptance letter came, saying she was so proud I felt safe enough to leave home after everything. Miles promised to drive up once a month to visit, and Mom was already planning care packages full of snacks and stupid notes, and nobody mentioned asking Dad for help with tuition, even though we all knew money would be tight. The night before I left for college, Mom threw this big dinner with Steve and his kids and some neighbors, everyone talking and laughing at the same time. Steve's younger kid knocked over a plate and it shattered on the floor, and for a second everyone went quiet until we all started laughing at the mess. That's when it really hit me that we were free, that breaking things and making noise was just part of life and not some crime that needed punishment. Right before graduation, Dad sent a card with a check for $500 and a note saying he was proud despite everything that happened between us. He wrote that he was going to therapy twice a week now and learning about something called emotional regulation and distress tolerance. The check is still in my desk drawer uncashed because taking his money feels like accepting his apology, and I'm not there yet even if he's making progress. That first week at college orientation, they made us do this icebreaker where everyone shared the weirdest rule from their house growing up. Some girl talked about mandatory family game night, and a guy complained about his mom's no phones at dinner rule, while I sat there knowing I was about to win this thing without even trying. When my turn came, I pulled out my phone and showed them the local news article about the house fire with Dad's photo holding his melted decibel meter while firefighters worked behind him. The whole circle went dead quiet until someone asked if that was real, and I just nodded and explained the 30 decibel rule and the soundproof slippers and going outside to cough. My roommate leaned over and promised to play music as loud as I wanted whenever I needed it, and everyone else just stared like they couldn't process that level of crazy. Mom started calling every Sunday morning, and we'd talk for 2 or 3 hours about nothing important. Just random stuff like what she made for dinner or some show she was watching. She kept saying the apartment felt too quiet without us, which made us both laugh at how backwards that was after years of forced silence. She was dating this guy from her support group who had normal volume conversations and actually enjoyed going to concerts with her. Miles enrolled in trade school for electrical work and met this girl whose dad had controlled every bite of food she ate, weighing portions and counting calories since she was 8. They spent their lunch breaks trading stories about hiding food and secret TVs and all the ways kids learn to survive impossible rules. She understood why he still whispered sometimes without him having to explain anything, and they started spending time together outside of class. 3 years after the fire, Dad sent this long email about how he understood if we never wanted to see him again, but he was there if we changed our minds. He wrote about going to therapy 3 times a week now and volunteering at some crisis center on weekends helping other people with control issues. The email had links to his therapist's professional page and the crisis center's website like he needed to prove he was really doing the work. I didn't respond, but Mom printed it out and put it in that folder with his other letters just in case. 4 years went by, and I graduated with my social work degree while Miles finished his electrician certification and started his own business. Mom married her boyfriend in this outdoor ceremony, where the DJ played music so loud, the cops showed up to check on the noise complaint, and everyone just laughed and turned it down a little. Miles made jokes in his toast about finally knowing how to properly tape electrical cords, and I talked about finding our voices after years of silence, and Mom just cried happy tears through the whole thing. Dad sent graduation cards with these long notes about being proud of us despite everything, and mentioned he'd removed all the soundproofing from his new place. He wrote that his therapist called it tremendous progress when he could sleep without noise-canceling headphones and tolerate his neighbor's normal living sounds. The checks he included stayed in my desk drawer with all the others, because cashing them felt like accepting something I wasn't ready to accept. 5 years after the fire, Miles called to tell me his girlfriend was pregnant, and they were putting Mom down as guardian in all their paperwork without even discussing it. We all knew without saying it that Dad would never meet this kid alone, maybe not at all, because some bridges stay burned no matter how much therapy someone gets. Miles bought a house 2 streets over from Mom and installed the electrical system himself, triple-checking every connection and using proper materials for everything. We found our own kinds of peace that had nothing to do with silence and everything to do with choosing our own noise levels. The fire that almost killed us ended up saving our lives in ways Dad's perfect silence never could have, giving us permission to exist at whatever volume felt right for us. Well, folks, that's it from me today. Thanks for sticking with me and letting me throw my thoughts and questions out there along the way. I really appreciate it. Like the video, it helps more than you think.